On the morning of June 7, 1944, a 19-year-old rifleman named Robert Chen from San Francisco crouched behind a disabled Sherman tank on the Norman coast and listened to a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A sound unlike anything he had heard during training or imagined in his most vivid nightmares. A sound that his platoon sergeant had tried to prepare him for during the crossing from England, but which no description could adequately capture until you heard it yourself and felt the primal fear that it triggered in every fiber of your being. The sound was a continuous, tearing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a mechanical scream that lasted not for seconds, but for 8 or 10 or 12 seconds, in sustained bursts that sounded less like individual gunshots and more like a massive piece of industrial machinery ripping apart sheet metal at impossible speed. And Chen's first coherent thought upon hearing this sound was that the Germans had deployed some kind of new wonder weapon that fired so fast that individual shots blended into a single sustained roar that made conventional machine gun fire sound like sporadic rifle shots by comparison. What Chen was hearing, what tens of thousands of Allied soldiers heard for the first time during the Normandy invasion, and what hundreds of thousands more would hear over the next 11 months of fighting across France and Belgium and Germany, was the MG-42, a German general-purpose machine gun that fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, roughly twice as fast as any comparable Allied weapon, and which had earned the nickname Hitler's Buzzsaw, or simply the Buzzsaw, because its distinctive sound resembled a power saw cutting through wood at maximum speed, and because that sound had a psychological effect on Allied infantry that was almost as devastating as the weapon's actual destructive power. The MG-42's impact on Allied morale and tactical doctrine was so significant that by late 1944, military psychologists and training officers were conducting studies on how to reduce the fear response that the weapon's sound triggered in soldiers who had never encountered it before, and these studies led to a specific training program designed to convince Allied troops that despite its terrifying sound and impressive rate of fire, the MG-42 was not actually a superweapon that made German infantry invincible, but rather a conventional weapon with significant limitations that could be countered through proper tactics and aggressive action. The training materials developed from these studies contained a phrase that became famous among Allied infantry: "Don't fear the buzzsaw," a slogan that appeared in training manuals, orientation lectures, and even propaganda posters, but which many veterans later recalled with bitter irony. Because while the advice was technically sound from a tactical perspective, it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of fear and the reality of combat. Where intellectual understanding that a weapon has limitations does nothing to reduce the visceral terror you feel when that weapon is firing at you with a rate of fire that seems physically impossible, and that makes every other sound on the battlefield fade into insignificance. The story of how Germany came to field the most feared machine gun of World War II begins not with tactical requirements or battlefield experience, but with the harsh lessons of World War I, where German machine gun doctrine had been built around the Maxim-derived MG-08, a water-cooled heavy machine gun that weighed over 60 pounds with its mount and required a crew of 4 to 6 men to transport and operate effectively, creating a tactical situation where German defensive positions were built around fixed machine gun emplacements that provided devastating firepower, but which lacked mobility and could not easily be repositioned once emplaced. The MG-08 and its successor, the MG-34, were excellent weapons in terms of reliability and sustained fire capability, but German tactical theorists recognized during the interwar period that future warfare would emphasize mobility and rapid maneuver rather than the static trench warfare that had characterized 1914 through 1918, and this recognition led to a revolutionary concept called the general-purpose machine gun, or Einheitsmaschinengewehr, that would combine the sustained fire capability of a heavy machine gun with the portability and quick deployment characteristics of a light machine gun, creating a single weapon that could serve multiple tactical roles rather than requiring separate weapons for different situations. The contract to develop this revolutionary weapon went to Mauser in 1937, and the lead designer was a relatively unknown engineer named Werner Gruner, who approached the problem with fresh eyes unconstrained by the traditional gun-making methods that had dominated firearms design for centuries. And Gruner's key insight was that achieving the required 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire would require abandoning the traditional belt feed systems used in earlier machine guns and instead developing a new feed mechanism that could strip rounds from the belt, chamber them, fire them, extract the spent cases, and chamber fresh rounds fast enough to maintain the desired cyclic rate without jamming or causing excessive wear on the mechanism. The solution that Gruner developed was an ingenious system using a rotating bolt head similar to a rifle bolt, but actuated by a short recoil mechanism that cycled so quickly that the weapon's barrel had to be designed for rapid changing because sustained fire at 1,200 rounds per minute would heat the barrel to temperatures that would cause warping and premature failure if the barrel could not be swapped out after firing 250 rounds. Roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire. The resulting weapon, designated the MG42, entered production in 1942 and immediately proved itself to be one of the most effective infantry weapons ever designed, combining a rate of fire that was 50% higher than comparable Allied machine guns with a weight of just 25 pounds in its light machine gun configuration and the ability to be mounted on various tripods and vehicle mounts for sustained defensive fire or mobile offensive operations. The MG42's mechanical operation was based on principles that were well understood by firearms designers, but which had never been successfully combined in a single weapon that could be manufactured in large quantities with reasonable cost and complexity. And the key innovation was the use of a roller-delayed blowback system that allowed the bolt to begin opening as soon as chamber pressure dropped to safe levels, while still providing enough resistance to prevent premature extraction that would tear caseheads off and cause catastrophic jams. This mechanism worked because two cylindrical rollers embedded in the bolt head were forced outward into recesses in the barrel extension when the weapon fired, and these rollers created a mechanical advantage that slowed the rearward movement of the bolt assembly during the critical first milliseconds after firing while gas pressure was still dangerously high. But as the bolt moved rearward and the rollers were forced inward by cam surfaces machined into the barrel extension, the mechanical advantage decreased and the bolt accelerated rearward to complete the extraction and ejection cycle before returning forward under spring pressure to chamber the next round and repeat the cycle. This entire process from firing to chambering the next round took just 50 milliseconds, 1/20th of a second, a cycle time that required extraordinary precision in manufacturing and timing, because if any component was even slightly out of specification, the weapon would either jam or suffer. Accelerated wear that would cause failure after relatively few rounds fired. The weapon's technical specifications were impressive by any standard. Overall length of 48 inches with a 21-inch barrel, weight of 25.5 pounds in the light machine gun configuration with bipod or 37 pounds when mounted on the sustained fire tripod, muzzle velocity of 2,400 feet per second, with standard German 7.92 mm Mauser ammunition, effective range of approximately 1,000 yards when fired from the tripod with trained crews. Though practical combat range was typically limited to 400 to 600 yards due to visibility and target identification limitations, the barrel could be changed in approximately 5 seconds by a trained crew, requiring the assistant gunner to release the barrel locking latch while the gunner lifted the receiver cover, allowing the hot barrel to be extracted and replaced with a cool barrel before closing the receiver and resuming fire. And this quick change capability, meant that a well-supplied crew could maintain nearly continuous fire for extended periods by rotating through multiple barrels that were allowed to cool between uses. The feed system used non-disintegrating metal link belts that held 50 rounds each and could be linked together to create longer belts for sustained fire operations, and the gun could fire from either the left or right side depending on which side the belt was loaded from, providing flexibility for different tactical situations and mounting configurations that made the weapon adaptable to various vehicles and fixed positions. German industry proved remarkably capable of manufacturing the MG42 in enormous quantities despite its demanding tolerances and complex feed mechanism, producing approximately 400,000 units between 1942 and 1945, at a time when German production capacity was under constant attack from Allied bombing and when raw materials were increasingly scarce, and this production achievement reflected both German engineering sophistication and the weapon's clever design that used stamped sheet metal components wherever possible rather than requiring expensive machined parts. The cost per weapon was approximately 250 Reichsmarks in 1942, roughly equivalent to $350 in contemporary American currency, making it more expensive than rifles, but significantly cheaper than the American Browning M2 heavy machine gun that cost approximately $700 per unit, and which had a much lower rate of fire and lacked the MG42's tactical versatility. The economic calculation from the German perspective was that a single MG42 with a well-trained crew could provide the firepower of 3 or 4 soldiers armed with rifles, meaning that despite its cost, the weapon actually reduced the total manpower requirements for a given level of combat effectiveness, a critical consideration for Germany, whose population was smaller than the combined Allied forces and which needed to maximize the combat effectiveness of every soldier through superior weapons and tactics. Allied soldiers first encountered the MG42 in significant numbers during the Tunisia campaign in late 1942 and early 1943, and the initial after-action reports from American and British units described a weapon that seemed to fire so fast that individual shots could not be distinguished, and that created a nearly impenetrable cone of fire that made advancing across open ground suicidal, and that forced attacking infantry to seek whatever cover was available, even if that cover was minimal or tactically disadvantageous. British veterans of the North African campaign, who had faced the earlier MG34, reported that the MG42 was noticeably faster firing and more intimidating, with one lieutenant describing his first encounter with the weapon as like facing a fire hose that shot bullets instead of water, a continuous stream rather than individual shots that you might dodge or survive through luck. American troops who landed in Sicily in July 1943 and then fought up the Italian peninsula encountered MG42s in defensive positions that German forces had prepared with careful attention to fields of fire and interlocking coverage. And these encounters drove home the lesson that attacking positions defended by MG42s required either overwhelming artillery support to suppress the guns before infantry advanced, or the use of infiltration tactics that allowed small units to approach gun positions from flanks or rear where the weapon's limited traverse made it less effective. The fighting at Monte Cassino in early 1944 provided particularly brutal lessons about the MG42's effectiveness when German paratroopers defending the monastery complex and surrounding heights established machine gun positions in stone buildings and bunkers that provided excellent protection while commanding clear fields of fire across the approaches that Allied forces had to cross to reach the German lines, and multiple Allied assaults failed with heavy casualties before artillery and aerial bombing finally reduced the German positions sufficiently to allow infantry to advance. One American company commander, who participated in 3 failed assaults on German positions near Cassino, reported that his company lost 47 men out of 190 in a single day's fighting. with medical officers estimating that approximately 60% of the casualties were caused directly or indirectly by MG42 fire that pinned down attacking troops and forced them to remain exposed to mortar and artillery fire that would normally have been avoided through rapid movement. The psychological impact of the MG42's distinctive sound was documented in multiple studies conducted by Allied military psychologists who interviewed combat veterans and attempted to understand why this particular weapon seemed to generate fear responses that were disproportionate to its actual lethality compared to other weapons that caused more casualties, but which did not produce the same level of dread. The studies concluded that the MG42's effect was primarily due to its sustained fire capability and distinctive sound signature that triggered instinctive fear responses in soldiers who heard it, because the human brain is wired to recognize threats based partly on auditory cues, and the continuous roaring buzz of the MG42 was unlike any natural or mechanical sound that soldiers had experienced in civilian life, making it seem alien and overwhelming in ways that more familiar sounds like artillery explosions or rifle fire did not. The psychological effect was amplified by the fact that soldiers could not distinguish individual bullets from the MG42's fire, creating the impression that the entire space between them and the gun position was filled with bullets traveling so densely that survival was impossible, even though the actual density of fire was not significantly different from slower-firing machine guns that achieved similar effect through longer bursts rather than higher rates of fire. The Don't Fear the Buzzsaw training program that Allied forces implemented in late 1944 attempted to reduce this psychological impact through a combination of familiarization and tactical education, with soldiers being exposed to recordings of MG42 fire during training so that the sound would not be completely novel when encountered in combat, and being taught specific tactical responses that emphasized the weapon's limitations rather than its impressive capabilities. The training materials stressed several key points. First, that the MG42's high rate of fire meant it consumed ammunition very quickly, and therefore had to fire in short bursts to avoid exhausting its ammunition supply, creating brief windows when the gun was not firing that alert soldiers could exploit to advance or change position. Second, that the weapon's fast fire rate actually reduced its accuracy at longer ranges because the rapid recoil impulses made it difficult to keep the gun on target during sustained bursts, meaning that soldiers who remained calm and used available cover effectively had good chances of surviving even when under MG42 fire. Third, that the MG42 was most effective when firing at targets in the open at medium ranges of 200 to 400 yards, but was much less effective at close range where its traverse limitations and the difficulty of engaging rapidly moving targets made it vulnerable to infantry assault. The training program also emphasized that every MG42 position had flanks and dead zones that could be exploited through fire and maneuver tactics, and that the weapon's impressive rate of fire was ultimately less important than proper employment and tactical positioning, factors that Allied infantry could influence through aggressive action and proper small unit tactics. The reality of the MG42's combat effectiveness was complex and somewhat contradictory, because while the weapon was undeniably devastating when properly employed in defensive positions with good fields of fire and adequate ammunition supply, it also had significant limitations that made it less effective than its fearsome reputation suggested, and that explained why Allied casualties from MG42 fire were not dramatically higher than casualties from other weapons, despite the psychological impact it produced. The weapon's 1,200 rounds per minute cyclic rate meant that a standard 50-round belt lasted just 2.5 seconds of continuous fire, and a typical 250-round belt that German machine gun crews carried as their standard combat load lasted only 12.5 seconds if fired continuously, creating a tactical situation where gunners had to fire in short, controlled bursts of 5 to 10 rounds to make their ammunition last. And these bursts, although impressively fast, were not fundamentally different in effect from the longer bursts that Allied machine gunners fired from their slower cycling weapons. The MG-42's ammunition consumption during sustained combat was prodigious, with a single gun potentially expending 3,000 to 5,000 rounds during an intense firefight lasting 15 to 30 minutes. And this consumption rate created logistical challenges for German forces that were often operating with limited ammunition supplies, and that could not always provide their machine gun crews with the ammunition they needed to fully exploit the weapon's capabilities. The MG-42's barrel changing system that allowed crews to swap overheated barrels in seconds was essential for sustained fire operations, but also created tactical vulnerabilities, because during the 5 to 8 seconds required to open the receiver, remove the hot barrel, insert a cool barrel, and close the receiver, the weapon was completely out of action, and the crew was vulnerable to enemy fire, and alert Allied infantrymen learned to listen for the pause in firing that indicated a barrel change, and to use these moments to advance or shift position. German doctrine specified that crews should carry at least 2 spare barrels per weapon to allow continuous operation during prolonged engagements, but the weight of these barrels at 4.5 pounds each, plus the weight of additional ammunition, meant that machine gun crews were heavily burdened and less mobile than rifle squads, a tactical trade-off that made sense in defensive operations where the crew could prepare positions and stockpile ammunition, but which was problematic during offensive operations or retreats where the crew had to move quickly while carrying all their equipment. The MG-42's effectiveness was also highly dependent on crew training and coordination, because operating the weapon at maximum effectiveness required a gunner who could control bursts and traverse smoothly, an assistant gunner who could load fresh belts quickly and monitor ammunition consumption, and ammunition bearers who could keep the gun supplied during sustained engagements. And while German machine gun crews were generally well-trained and effective, the quality declined noticeably during 1944 and 1945 as experienced personnel were killed or transferred, and replacements received abbreviated training that did not fully prepare them for the demands of operating such a sophisticated weapon system under combat conditions. Robert Chen survived his first encounter with the MG-42 on June 7, 1944, by doing exactly what his training had emphasized he should not do, which was freezing in place behind the disabled Sherman tank and remaining absolutely still for nearly 20 minutes until the German gun shifted its fire to other targets, and his squad leader was able to crawl forward and direct the squad to a covered position in a roadside ditch where they could regroup and plan their next move. Chen later reflected that the "Don't Fear the Buzzsaw" training had been theoretically correct, but practically useless. Because when you heard that sound for the first time and saw the dirt erupting in continuous fountains where the bullets impacted, and watched the metal surfaces of the Sherman tank spark and ring as rounds struck at intervals measured in tiny fractions of a second, your brain simply shut down rational thought and activated its most primitive survival instincts, which said freeze and hide and hope the predator passes by, and no amount of training or intellectual understanding could override that response until you had been exposed to the sound multiple times, and your brain learned through repeated experience that survival was possible even when under fire from this seemingly invincible weapon. Chen's unit fought through France and Belgium and into Germany over the following 10 months, and by the end of the war, he had been under MG-42 fire dozens of times and had learned to identify the weapon's sound instantly and to react with tactical movement rather than paralysis. But he also learned that the training program's emphasis on not fearing the weapon was misguided, because healthy fear was what kept you alive and made you seek cover and move carefully and avoid exposed positions where the MG-42's high rate of fire would cut you down before you could react. And the soldiers who truly did not fear the buzzsaw were often the ones who died because they took risks that no rational person should take when facing a weapon that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute at them. The tactical evolution that occurred as Allied forces gained experience fighting German forces equipped with MG-42s led to several doctrinal changes that emphasized the importance of artillery support, smoke screens, and infiltration tactics rather than frontal assaults across open ground, where the MG-42's advantages were most pronounced. And these changes reflected a realistic assessment that while the MG-42 was not invincible, it was effective enough that attempting to overcome it through sheer courage or aggressive tactics would result in unacceptable casualties. American infantry doctrine by late 1944 specified that platoons encountering MG-42 positions should immediately call for artillery fire to suppress or destroy the gun rather than attempting to assault the position directly. And when artillery was unavailable or ineffective, the preferred tactic was to use smoke grenades to obscure the gun's field of fire, while riflemen maneuvered to flank positions from which they could engage the crew with rifle fire or grenades. British infantry developed similar tactics based on their experiences in Italy and Northwest Europe, emphasizing the importance of identifying MG-42 positions through reconnaissance before launching attacks, and then using concentrated mortar fire or tank support to suppress the guns during the critical minutes when infantry were most vulnerable while crossing open ground to close with enemy positions. The Eastern Front provided a different perspective on the MG-42's effectiveness because Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized mass infantry assaults supported by artillery preparation rather than the more deliberate advance under fire techniques that Western Allied forces employed. And German machine gun crews on the Eastern Front often faced situations where hundreds or thousands of Soviet infantry would assault their positions in waves that accepted extremely heavy casualties in order to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numerical superiority. German veterans of the Eastern Front reported that the MG-42's high rate of fire and quick barrel change capability were essential for survival during these mass assaults, because the weapon could fire continuously for extended periods as long as ammunition and spare barrels were available, creating casualties among attacking Soviet forces at rates that would have been impossible with slower-firing weapons. One German machine gunner who fought at Kursk in July 1943 reported firing approximately 12,000 rounds during a single day of combat, going through 8 barrels and requiring constant resupply of ammunition from other members of his squad who spent the entire battle carrying ammunition boxes forward from supply dumps located several hundred yards to the rear. The psychological effect of the MG-42 on Soviet infantry was reportedly less pronounced than its effect on Western Allied troops, because Soviet tactical doctrine explicitly accepted high casualty rates as the price of achieving objectives, and because Soviet soldiers were generally less influenced by the distinctive sound of German weapons that had become familiar through years of continuous combat on the Eastern Front. The Allied response to the MG-42 threat also included attempts to capture and study the weapon, to understand its mechanical principles, and potentially develop countermeasures or similar weapons for Allied forces, and several hundred MG-42s were captured during the course of the war and subjected to detailed technical analysis that revealed both the weapon's sophistication and the manufacturing challenges that made it impossible for Allied industry to simply copy the design and produce it in quantity. American ordnance experts who examined captured MG-42s were impressed by the weapon's mechanical elegance and its use of advanced manufacturing techniques, including extensive use of stamped components and spot welding that reduced production time and cost, but they also recognized that the weapon's roller-delayed blowback system required extremely tight tolerances and precise timing that would be difficult to achieve in mass production without significant development time and specialized tooling. The British conducted similar studies and reached similar conclusions, recognizing that while the MG42 was an excellent weapon, it was not a revolutionary advance that changed the fundamental nature of infantry combat, but rather an incremental improvement over existing designs that achieved higher performance through clever engineering and sophisticated manufacturing, rather than through any breakthrough technological innovation. The question of whether the MG42 actually provided German forces with a significant tactical advantage, or whether its psychological impact exceeded its practical effectiveness, remained subject to debate among military historians and veterans for decades after the war, with some arguing that the weapon's fearsome reputation was justified by its combat record, and others contending that Allied forces' emphasis on the MG42 threat was disproportionate to the weapon's actual impact on battlefield outcomes. Statistical analysis of casualty data from various campaigns suggested that the MG42 caused roughly the same percentage of Allied casualties as the earlier MG34, despite its higher rate of fire, supporting the argument that rate of fire alone was not the primary determinant of machine gun effectiveness, and that factors like crew training, tactical positioning, fields of fire, and ammunition supply were equally or more important than raw cyclic rate. The psychological impact of the weapon's distinctive sound was undeniable and measurably affected Allied infantry morale and tactical decision-making. But whether this psychological effect translated into actual combat advantages for German forces was less clear, because while Allied soldiers feared the MG42, they also developed effective counter-tactics that minimized their exposure to the weapon's fire, and that allowed them to successfully assault and overcome defensive positions even when those positions were defended by multiple MG42s with well-trained crews. The post-war fate of the MG42 design provided perhaps the strongest evidence of the weapon's fundamental effectiveness, because after Germany's defeat, multiple nations, including West Germany, Yugoslavia, Spain, and Turkey, either continued manufacturing the MG42 under license or developed weapons based directly on its operating principles, creating a family of machine guns designated the MG1, MG2, and MG3 that remained in service with various military forces into the 21st century, more than 70 years after the original design was completed. The MG3 variant, still used by the German Bundeswehr and several other NATO forces, fires the standard NATO 7.62 mm cartridge at a cyclic rate of 1,100 to 1,200 rounds per minute, and retains the roller-delayed blowback operation and quick-change barrel system that made the original MG42 so effective. And the weapon's longevity in military service, despite enormous advances in materials, manufacturing technology, and weapons design philosophy, demonstrates that Werner Gruner's basic design was not just effective for the specific conditions of World War II, but rather represented a genuinely superior approach to general-purpose machine gun design that has proven difficult to improve upon even with modern technology and 7 decades of additional development experience. The American military's response to the MG42 threat eventually led to the development of the M60 machine gun in the late 1950s, a weapon that borrowed heavily from German design principles, including the use of a quick-change barrel system and a gas-operated mechanism that achieved higher rates of fire than earlier American machine guns, though the M60's cyclic rate of 550 rounds per minute was still less than half the MG42's rate, and the weapon suffered from reliability problems and awkward handling characteristics that made it less beloved by American troops than the older but more reliable Browning M1919 that it was designed to replace. The Soviet Union's response was different, developing the PK machine gun series that used a traditional Kalashnikov-style gas operation and rotating bolt, but which incorporated quick-change barrel capability and belt feed systems that reflected lessons learned from studying captured German weapons, and the PK proved to be one of the most successful machine gun designs of the Cold War era, with production exceeding millions of units and service in dozens of countries worldwide. These post-war developments demonstrated that the MG42's influence extended far beyond its direct combat effectiveness during World War II, and that the weapon had fundamentally changed how military forces thought about machine gun design and employment, shifting from the pre-war concept of distinct heavy and light machine guns serving different tactical roles to the modern concept of a single general-purpose machine gun that could serve multiple roles through the use of different mounting systems and tactical employment doctrines. The soldiers who faced the MG42 in combat generally maintained throughout their lives that the weapon was the most terrifying they encountered during the war, not because it was necessarily more lethal than artillery or mortars or rifle fire, but because its distinctive sound and seemingly impossible rate of fire created a psychological experience that was unique and unforgettable, and many veterans reported that they could still hear that characteristic ripping roar in their memories decades after the war ended, and that the sound could trigger flashbacks and anxiety responses even in peaceful settings if they encountered similar mechanical sounds. The "Don't Fear the Buzzsaw" training program's failure to effectively reduce this psychological impact was not due to poor design or implementation, but rather reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how fear works and how combat trauma affects soldiers, because intellectual knowledge that a weapon has limitations and can be defeated through proper tactics does nothing to eliminate the visceral fear response that occurs when you're under fire from that weapon, and when your survival depends on making correct tactical decisions while your brain is flooded with stress hormones and your body is preparing for fight-or-flight responses that override rational thought. Robert Chen, who survived his first encounter with the MG42 by freezing in place, eventually learned to function effectively under fire from the weapon and completed his service without serious physical injury. But he carried the psychological scars of those encounters for the rest of his life and reported in interviews conducted in the 1990s that he still had nightmares about the buzzsaw's sound, and that he avoided using power tools or being near construction sites where mechanical sounds might trigger memories of those terrible minutes when the world seemed to be filled with nothing but that continuous tearing roar that meant death was seeking you, and that survival was a matter of luck and chance rather than skill or courage. The ultimate assessment of the MG42's historical significance must balance its undeniable technical excellence and innovative design against the reality that it did not provide German forces with sufficient advantages to overcome Allied superiority in numbers, industrial capacity, tactical air power, and logistical support. And while individual German soldiers armed with MG42s could and did inflict severe casualties on Allied forces and could temporarily halt attacks or disrupt tactical plans, the cumulative effect of these tactical successes was insufficient to change strategic outcomes or prevent Germany's inevitable defeat once the industrial and manpower resources of the United States and Soviet Union were fully mobilized. The MG42 was perhaps the finest machine gun design of World War II, and arguably one of the finest infantry weapons ever developed by any nation, but it was also a weapon that demonstrated the limits of technological superiority in warfare, because superior weapons and equipment cannot compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages in resources, geography, and alliance structures that determine the outcomes of large-scale conflicts between modern industrialized states. The soldiers who faced the buzzsaw and survived learned lessons about fear, courage, tactics, and the nature of combat that shaped their lives and influenced military doctrine for generations. But they also learned that even the most terrifying weapon can be overcome through determination, proper tactics, mutual support among comrades, and the simple arithmetic of industrial warfare, where the side that can produce more weapons and train more soldiers will eventually prevail, regardless of whether their individual weapons are technically inferior to those of their opponents. A harsh lesson that Germany learned at tremendous cost during 6 years of total war that destroyed their nation and killed millions of their citizens, while ultimately demonstrating that wars are won by factories and logistics, and national will as much as by tactical excellence or superior weapons design.